This is a recording of the keynote I gave at the Design and Technology Teacher Education Symposium that was held at Made UK on Monday the 2nd of June 2025. And I was asked to talk to this group, this new group of people, about an aspect of design and technology teacher education. And I spoke about beyond ours is not to reason why, about how design and technology teacher educators are stakeholders in educational change. So first of all, if you're watching this and you don't know anything about me, this is me. I'm Dr. Alison Hardy. I'm an Associate Professor at Nottingham Trent University. I'm not going to read through all of that. You can see that. But if you want to know more about me and if you want to connect with me, you can scan the code and you get to my link tree and you'll see all the different links about me. So it'd be lovely to hear from anybody who takes the time to listen to this. So let's move on. What was I going to talk about? So I was thinking one day when I was out walking Kip, and if you listen to my Talking D&T podcast, you'll hear Kip feature quite regularly. There he is, walking along the street. And I was reflecting on what I see in PGCE students in design and technology. And I was also reflecting on online discourse about design and technology education and its direction and what's happening at the moment, particularly in England, with the curriculum and assessment review. And there was this troubling pattern emerging about that led me to think about where do we actually fit in the D&T education ecosystem. And what I mean by that is where do design and technology teacher educators fit in what's going on nationally around the subject design and technology. I'm just going to take a moment here to reflect on what happened in the morning at the symposium. Is that there was a group of people, and I'm not going to remember all their names because I know I'm going to forget, but I know they're all lovely. I think there was Bav, Torben, Jason, and Danielle. No, Janine. Janine's going to laugh at me saying that. So they were talking about issues within design and technology education that they saw at the moment, and that was a really good starting point for the day. And it's good to have that discourse, but I think we also need to think about where do we fit and where do we have any power or any stake. So that took me back to this stakeholder theory that came from Mitchell, Agel and Wood from 1997 that I use as part of my doctorate and as part of my research, thinking about who are the stakeholders and what are their attributes. So to have salience, Mitchell, Agel and Wood argue that you need to have these three characteristics: power, legitimacy and urgency. And those with power have the ability to impose will or influence outcomes. They can actually make the change. Those who have legitimacy, they have a socially accepted right to act or make claims. And then there's this other characteristic of urgency where it's time-sensitive, critical claims requiring attention. So we might say, for example, in England at the moment, as we're going through a curriculum and assessment review, then there is an urgency to be trying to, as a stakeholder, have an impact on the outcomes of what might come out of that national curriculum review. So if we look at this model in more detail and we take it as a Venn diagram, if you have one attribute, you are a latent stakeholder. You have low salience. You have, low ability to make any difference. You do have a stake, but it's not. It's low. I can't think of any way of describing it other than to say it's low. If you have two attributes, you're expectant. So you're kind of on the cusp of having more or possibly having less. So you have moderate salience. And then those who kind of sit in the middle of this Venn diagram, they're the definitive stakeholders. They have high salience. And so we have to think about, where are D&T teacher educators? Do we have much salience? Do we have low, moderate or high? And this is my analysis. You might disagree, but I think we need to think about this. So D&T teacher educators today, and that's given the changes that we've gone through, is that actually they have limited direct influence over policy or curriculum. They work with student teachers and they have indirect influence over what happens in the classroom, but they don't actually have much power in terms of direct influence over what happens in the classroom, particularly as we know that the research says it's the mentors and the school ecosystem that has more power over what teachers do. And particularly when we see that in maths, when there's much more of a culture in some maths, so that's multi-academy trusts in England, that might have a standard curriculum that goes across a whole number of different schools. That kind of then takes away any power. I'm kind of always quite nervous about using that word sometimes, but direct influence over what happens. And then equally, where do teacher educators in a subject have direct influence over policy, over the actual curriculum, the national curriculum, and its delivery nationally? Well, we know that since, and I'm going to come on to this, a shift in where teacher education happens, and it's been, I want to say diluted, but it's more that it's been seeped out, and it's much more widespread, which in many ways is good, because you now have people involved in teacher education have a much more local understanding of the needs of the pupils, the schools, the locality, the environment. But equally, they're so disparate that you then don't necessarily have this collective body. So if we start to think about who has the legitimacy, well, we do have that professional standing as teacher educators. But some people might see us, whether we're the ones that are in higher education or whether we're the ones in schools or working across multi-academies or in private organisations, that's kind of irrelevant. But there is an ivory tower perception because we're not so much at that coalface with pupils. I mean, I haven't taught in schools for 15 years. So you could say I am in an ivory tower and I don't have an understanding, which is why over time I've withdrawn from going into schools and observing lessons, because in many ways I'm out of touch. But I do have a legitimacy about my professional standing, about the role of teacher education on shaping and developing and supporting student teachers and early career teachers. And then we take the last one about urgencies. Our concerns are rarely seen as urgent by policymakers. And if we also think about this diversification of the model of teacher education, then that does have a big influence as well. And so the only urgency we tend to have is at a very local level, where we know we've got organisations closing teacher training routes the other year where they weren't meeting the new DFE guidelines, so they weren't able to offer teacher education. But the subjects within that don't necessarily have their concerns held and understood, particularly when we have issues around bursaries and recruitment and so on. It's a really complex system, and people like Professor David Spendler have a much better handle on that aspect of it than I do. But I think it's a useful way of reflecting on what is the D&T teacher educators' position today in terms of their characteristics as stakeholders. So these, I think, are some of the systemic problems. So there's the Michael Gove legacy and the technician's route. And again, this isn't my particular strength of knowledge or understanding. I would suggest that you read David Spendler's book in the second edition of the Debates in Design and Technology book, where he talks about the rise and fall of D&T, and he touches on much more of these and has a much deeper philosophical understanding and political understanding than I do. But we know that teaching has been reduced to much more of a technical delivery. We know that on many teacher training validated courses now, there's a preferred reading list that's directed from the Department for Education, so agency is removed, so we have an apprenticeship model in teacher preparation that drive away from moving that's a vocation. Performance metrics become a big driver that's in schools, so we've got student teachers moving into schools, primary and secondary, and we've got performance metrics. They're affected by that in the amount of teaching time they have, potentially in primary particularly, or even in Key Stage 4 in upper secondary, in secondary schools. And there's a do or die culture, don't question, just deliver. And we know with some of the style that's expected, the set text that teachers are expected to follow, is you do it and you don't question why. And so you think, okay, so who does have this salience? Who's been given the salience if teacher educators have lost? They never had a huge amount, but they had more than they have now. Who has it now? Well, exam boards do. We do know that the qualifications tail wags the curriculum dog. We know that Ofsted does. They come in and they measure and they report. And we know there's evidence from the Design and Technology Association, for example, about the increase in design and technology in primary, and that's been driven very much by Ofsted coming in, particularly under the previous Chief Inspector, about looking at curriculum and a broad and balanced curriculum. We started to see that rippling through into secondary. So it's going to be interesting to know, with the changes to the Ofsted framework or the Ofsted report card that's been proposed, what effect that might have. They have salience. And then the Department for Education obviously has a huge amount of salience in terms of setting out what the performance measures are for different schools, setting out the curriculum and where the funding goes and what the funding can be used for. So all of these things have an impact on the role of the teacher and the teacher educator. So how do we sit in that? So this do or die culture that I talk about is, if we've got design and technology teacher educators who have low salience, so they only have one of those characteristics, and I've indicated that the only one that they have is legitimacy, and they're training teachers who have low salience, that they have power when they close their doors in their classrooms, but only to a point when we start to think about performance measures and walkarounds, and where there is that loss of professional agency about what's expected and the structure of lessons and how things are managed and consistency. So we have teachers that have low salience. And we know from the research that that leads to stress compliant practitioners with no agency. And we know what happens if we have no agency. We're educated to a high standard. We are enabled through our undergraduate degrees and those of us who go on to do further study, but less so now in the PGCE, to have that criticality that there used to be around education. So now we have stressed, compliant agent practitioners with no agency. And I think that leads to this view of theirs is not to reason why, theirs is but to do or die. So because we're in this performance with no power, with no urgency, where we have no agency, it has this knock-on effect. And I think that is something that we need to think about. So this becomes a vicious circle. So how do we move from latent to definitive stakeholders? Is it actually possible? Well, okay, I think one of the things we have to think about is, are we training or are we educating student teachers? We've fallen into where ITT, not ITE. So into initial teacher training, not initial teacher educating. And again, David Spendler talks about this in a much more articulate way than I do. But it does make me think about what we're doing. So if we lecture about active learning, what's the message? So if we're lecturing, then potentially we're training. If we're not using active learning and unpicking it, what are we actually saying? Is that more educating? If we don't question curriculum, if we don't question the whys. I taught on the PGCE a little bit this year, and I was asked to do something about a report from the EEF. And I felt we were being asked to use it in a way that wasn't appropriate for what we were looking at. And I questioned the curriculum in front of the students, not in a vicious, unpicking, nasty way. It was more of I'm just curious about, how do you think that what I'm talking about here fits with what you're doing? And getting feedback and then giving my perspective and allowing them to question me about what I was saying. And one of them actually said, why are you doing this? And I said, well, I have to be true to myself and my values. And this isn't sitting comfortably with me. And I want to be honest about that. But equally, I have this curriculum I have to get through. But I have to do that in such a way where I'm staying true to myself. Me even saying that might get me into trouble, but I'll have that conversation another day with somebody maybe. And if we lack criticality ourselves, what do we develop in our students? And particularly in design and technology, I think when we're training student teachers to go and teach a subject where we want them, we want our pupils in schools to use design thinking, to be critical about things that are around them, to be critical about the made world. Then if we're passive, then what are we passing on? So I think then as teacher educators, we have to become more critical. So this took me back to something very early on when I started in teacher education in 2010 at Nottingham Trent. I'd previously been a mentor in school, so I was kind of quite experienced around that. And I went on a teacher education Advancement Network team, who's now just recently become part of the BERA group, which I think is fantastic. And I went on this Becoming a Teacher Educator day, and it was a really great bit of training, really kicked me into all sorts of things. It was fantastic. And they talked about this paper, Swennen, Lundenberg and Corthagen from 2008, Preach What You Teach. Now, I am so far away now from this paper that I'm a little bit concerned that I'm misinterpreting what it said. So you might want to go back, but I'm saying this is like the springboard of my thinking. And what they talked about is congruent teaching is not self-evident in teacher education. So what it means is that we lecture, but we don't unpick in front of the students, often enough, why we're choosing that method, that pedagogical approach to teach. And so we don't give them the language to enable them to talk about why they're doing what they're doing. And so I've got this image up here of the lanes. It was the best I could find to do this. And when I was doing the keynote, I was able to stand and do this in front of them. So I'm going to do this by my hands. So we stand and we teach, right? We do the thing that we've planned to do. And then we step out as teacher educators sometimes in a session and we say, let's look at what I've just done. Let's look at how I've done that and why I might have done it like that and why I might have chosen to do it like that. And then we step a bit further and we say, right, this is the underpinning theory or ideas that have informed my decisions about what I did. And I think that's really powerful to do. Now, sometimes if you do it too much, it can blow your students, teachers' heads off. And I did this early on. You know, when you kind of new into something and you discover something new and you want to tell everybody, that's what I was doing. I think I've become a little bit more measured since then, but maybe not. But I want them, so sometimes I might have done something that's like a hands-on approach where we would do something that was active, where they'd be sorting things and moving around. And then I'd step out and I'd say, I'm wanting you to experience that because you experience what active learning feels like. Not because you're children, because I want you to experience what it feels like. And I'm making that explicit. And then I might talk about what the theory is around that. That some things around memory about doing it, about the physicality of moving things. Now, this is where you can hear that my understanding about the theory of that is quite weak. And that's okay, because I could say in front of my student teachers, let's have a look and let's have a think about what the theory might be that informs active learning. Does it stand up to what we're doing? So that's enabling them to question. And I'm going to say that Fiona Patrick and David Morrison Love have done some really fascinating work around this in the context of design and technology education. So I'd take a look at that as well, where they do that with their student teachers, and they have an undergraduate course. How delightful that they can have an undergraduate course. We don't have those too much in England anymore, in the way that they do in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and in the island of Ireland. I've done some examining over at the University of Limerick, and they have them over an extended period of time. So you have this opportunity to have this deep thinking about what's happening, rather than not questioning why, which is sad, but understandable sometimes. And then we have this added complexity, which I think we forget to talk about, is that we're modelling in this congruent teaching pedagogy for children to adults who are student teachers. And I don't think we talk about this dual challenge, particularly when we have such a condensed amount of time with student teachers. And so we do need to be aware of when we're going to do that stepping out, and also when we need to encourage them as adult learners to think about this for themselves. And so I would say this is the andragogy challenge. And so we know from the research, from the theory, from Malcolm Knowles about andragogy, that adult learners approach things very differently to children learners. Not everything, but there is an overlap, but some things. And it is about agency and self-direction. And it is about problems, not abstractions. So giving them a case. And this is the beautiful thing about what David and Fiona did. So they would ask the students, if I remember rightly, I'm sure they'll come back to me if I've got this wrong. They would ask them, the students, to take a lesson and take a lesson plan. that might be teaching an aspect of design and technology, and identify the theory that underpin that. And then this is what was even more fascinating sometimes, is that it wasn't just about the pedagogical theory, it was also about the design theory, about why this thing was taught, or about the the theory about apprenticeships, or the theory about manufacturing that might be, or it might not be theory, but it might be professionalisms. How do professions do this? And so it was a problem, not an abstraction. So not starting with the abstraction, starting with the problem and leading to the abstraction around the theory. And talking about Kip, he's just come to join me. He's obviously thinking, you've been in there for long enough. And it's experience, valuing their experience. So the hand that I've put up there is, we used to do this thing that came from Ian Mentor. Sorry, Kip is just going to come and join me. Come on then. Ian Mentor, who led a whole load of books on critical publishing publishers about teacher educators. Fantastic series. And there's a thing where they would get the student teachers, do you want to take part in this, do you? Draw around their hands, and on each thing, Kip's blurred, so you can't quite see that he's pouring at this, and helpfully moving the slides on. Draw around it, and then on each one put a D&T experience that they would then share with their group and share with their mentors and their teacher educators when they went in, to talk about what was influencing their decisions, to help them unpick how their experiences were shaping what they were doing, so it became collaborative. So now we've got a little bit of interruption here. The next thing I think we need to think about how we become definitive stakeholders, is what I think about we're standing on giant shoulders. There is a rich heritage in design and technology. There is decades of research and practice. And I've recently done a series on the podcast about what the research says about design and technology education. And I've only skimmed the surface of it. There are fantastic international perspectives. For example, in Australia, Finland and other places, there's been some brilliant stuff that's been happening in the Netherlands about making design thinking visible in lessons with young children. So I think that all gives us strength. It gives us more power in a way, because we have that expertise. And so that deep knowledge of D&T education gives us that power. It gives us that voice to speak out loud about the subject. So with expertise, there is potential for power and legitimacy. So how do we move from latent to definitive stakeholders? As you can see, Kip's obviously decided enough's enough. We are coming towards the end. So we get power through collective action and unity, and that's not just within the teacher education community, which I'll come on to, but it is with our students, with our mentors, with our international networks, and by having that deep expertise in design and technology education. We continue to have our legitimacy through this congruent teaching practice. As I said, not all the time, but some of the time stepping out and stepping out again, and drawing on that power that we have from our expertise. And using the research that we have access to, whether you're in universities or schools or in different partnerships and different spaces, to draw on that gives us that legitimacy. And we have urgency, because we can make things visible out what's at stake, that actually potentially we're leading to compliant pupils that don't understand this made world around us and are able to critique it and engage with it. And it highlights the consequence of do or die, this lack of agency, this exhaustion, this disempowerment. Is that the word? I don't know. And starting to explore what the potential impact might be of currency, of curriculum policies. It doesn't help that my picture is covering up the bit. And an example of this is, recently Ofsted had a consultation on their proposal, and I took the time to respond, just really from the perspective of design and technology, to think about, from my position of expertise in design and technology, what was I saying about the potential long-term impact of some of those recommendations about the report card on design and technology. And that's where I think we do have a voice, and I do think we have an urgency, because we have that expertise and that knowledge as well. So what does this lead us to? It leads me to thinking that as individual teacher educators, we have limited power. And that's where, the Lego is showing everybody as individual building blocks. But if we come together, then actually I think we have salience in collective action. And so we need to think and act as a professional community. And so that's why I'm really proud to have been one of the founding members of the Design and Technology Teacher Educator Group. Myself and Matt sort of kicked this off quite a few years ago, and Liam Anderson and Sarah Davis were involved, and Janine as well, and got involved. And then now that has grown to have a wonderful group of people involved, of Leanne Mee and Sarah Finnegan as well. And if I've missed anybody out, I do apologise. But then having all of us, I think there's about 25, 30 of us who came together on Monday, the 2nd of June, having that collective action, but actually doing something with it, sharing our research, sharing our agendas, responding to policy. We did that collectively 5-6 years ago about the bursary, and we got that reinstated. And so I think we need to think and act as a professional community. So I'm really proud to be part of the Design and Technology Teacher Education Group. And I'm also really delighted that it's been taken on by the next generation. As Matt keeps reminding me and him are now old hat. I am 15 years out of the classroom, but I do have a deep knowledge about policy and research and curriculum, but I don't have that local touch, that current touch of what's happening in the classroom. So it's good that we come together as a community. But if we don't build our stakeholder salience, and if we continue as latent stakeholders, we're acknowledged, we're seen a bit, but we're ignored, and we're producing compliant technicians in the classroom. And I mean compliant teacher technicians. Teachers in the classroom are just doing what they're told. But if we build definitive stakeholder salience through collective action, congruent practice, and make D&T's future urgent, then I think we have much more power, and we are claiming our place in the D&T ecosystem. So we need to act. So what will you do differently was my call to people last Monday. What will you do differently in the field of teacher education for design and technology? What will you do differently in your programme? Will you do some congruent teaching? Will you dig deeper into some of the theory that's relevant? What about your modelling of pedagogy? Will you think more deeply about some of that? Not all of it. We have to live. I have to walk the dog. I have to do the washing. I don't have capacity to do it all of the time, but just a bit of the time. What do you do in supporting colleagues in the D&T teacher education community? And how do you build the collective voice? Maybe some people in the group want to be the nudge rather than the voice at the front, or they've got the ideas but they don't know how to articulate it, or somebody does know how to articulate it but doesn't have the time to kind of feed that together. So how do we bring that together to have our collective voice? So how will we, as a design and technology teacher education community, support each other in becoming the stakeholders D&T education needs, as I see that they need? And I think we have a right to take that place. So that was the keynote I gave last week. That's the same link tree that's at the start. So if I've said anything there that's challenging, that you disagree with, this was the first time that I'd spoken about some of these ideas. So I was very upfront when I gave this last Monday that I'm still exploring some of this, and I'm very open about where some of my thinking is yet to be fully developed. So I'm open to ideas, I'm open to thoughts, to a point, if I'm honest. No, but I'm open to dialogue. And if anything, I just hope I've got people thinking. And if you're not part of the Design and Technology Teacher Educators Group, do join. So I think there's lots of opportunity. I'm really excited to see that there's already going to be a sub-working group around primary design and technology teacher education led by Janine, who also gave a keynote, which was fantastic and thought-provoking and really spoke from my heart. And there were a number of the working papers in the afternoon. And it was great because they were all people that were either recently in the classroom or very close to the classroom and working much more across schools than I do. So that gives me confidence for the future of design and technology teacher education. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope you'll be in touch. And if not, do join the organisation.